The goblet slipped from Alira Voss's fingers before she even reached the top of the marble stairs, and the sound of it shattering against the floor cut through the music like a blade through silk. Wine spread across the white stone in a dark red stain, and for one long, breathless moment, the entire hall of Ambervale Castle turned to look at her. Laughter came first from the back of the room, sharp and cruel, and then it spread like fire through dry grass. Nobles in silk and velvet raised their hands to their mouths, pretending to hide their smiles, though everyone could see them clearly. Somewhere near the musicians, a woman in a peacock blue gown whispered loudly enough for half the hall to hear. "There she goes again. The clumsy Voss girl." Alira felt her face burn, but she did not look down. She had learned long ago that looking down only made people believe they were right about her. She lifted her chin instead, smoothed the front of her simple gray dress, and stepped over the broken glass as if it did not matter at all. It mattered. It mattered more than anyone in that glittering room could have guessed. Her stepsisters, Beatrice and Nora, stood near the head table in gowns the color of ripe plums, their hair pinned with jewels that had once belonged to Alira's own mother. Beatrice pressed a hand to her chest in mock horror, though her eyes glittered with satisfaction. "Oh, how dreadful," Beatrice said, loud enough to carry. "Someone really should teach her how to walk in a room like this." Nora laughed behind her fan, and the sound of it was worse than any insult, because it told Alira exactly how much her stepsisters had wanted this moment, had perhaps even hoped for it, from the very second they had all stepped through the castle gates that evening. A servant hurried forward with a cloth to clean the mess, bowing his head so low that Alira could not see his face. She murmured an apology to him, quiet and sincere, though no one else in the hall seemed to think an apology was necessary for a servant. That was the difference between Alira and the people who mocked her. She still remembered that servants were people, even when she herself was being treated as something less than one. She made her way toward the far wall, away from the crowd, away from the candlelight that made every mistake visible to 100 watching eyes. The feast had only just begun, and already she wanted it to end. It was then that she felt it, a gaze, steady and unmoving, from the raised platform at the head of the hall. Duke Julian Ambervale sat at the high table, a goblet of his own untouched in front of him, and he was watching her, not laughing, not smiling, not even reacting the way the rest of his court expected a duke to react when a clumsy girl embarrassed herself at his feast. He simply watched, his dark eyes calm and unreadable, and something in that stillness made Alira's heart beat faster than the broken glass ever could have. She looked away first. She always looked away first, because looking too long at a duke was dangerous for a girl like her, even if he was the only person in that entire hall who had not laughed. What Alira did not know, what no one in that glittering room knew, was that Duke Julian Ambervale had known her name for 6 months already. He had read it in a letter sealed with her father's crest, a letter that named her, specifically and deliberately, as the woman he was meant to marry. He had not told a single soul. Alira found a quiet corner near a tall window, half hidden behind a velvet curtain, and pressed her back against the cool stone wall. From there, she could watch the feast without being watched in return, or so she believed. The musicians played a lively tune, and couples spun across the floor in bright colors, and somewhere in the crowd her stepsisters were already telling the story of the broken goblet to anyone who would listen, embellishing it with each retelling, until Alira herself would hardly recognize the girl they described. She closed her eyes for a moment and let herself remember why she had come. Her father, Edwin Voss, had been a good man, a quiet lord with modest lands and even more modest wealth, but a man of his word above all things. Before he passed, he had made an arrangement with a family of far greater standing, an arrangement sealed in ink and wax that Alira had only learned of after his death, when a solicitor read the letter aloud in a small, dusty study that still smelled of her father's pipe smoke. She had not been told the name of the Duke's family at the time, only that a promise had been made, and that promises made by her father were not to be broken, no matter how the world had changed around them. Elira opened her eyes and looked again toward the high table. Duke Julian had turned his attention to a conversation with an older man in silver robes, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw remained tight even as he nodded along to whatever was being said to him. He did not seem like a man enjoying his own feast. A voice beside her made her jump. "You should not stand so close to the window. The draft will ruin your dress before the night is done." Elira turned to find a young woman with warm brown eyes and a friendly, open face, dressed far more simply than most of the guests, though her posture suggested she belonged among them all the same. This was Charlotte Marrow, daughter of a merchant family that had recently risen in standing, and one of the very few people in the hall who had not laughed when the goblet fell. "I did not realize anyone would notice me over here," Elira said quietly. "I noticed," Charlotte said, and there was no pity in her voice, only honesty. "I also noticed that you did not cry, even when half the room was laughing at you. That takes more strength than most of these people will ever have." Elira managed a small, tired smile. "Strength or stubbornness, I have never been sure which one it is." "Perhaps both," Charlotte said, and looped her arm gently through Elira's. "Come. If you stand here alone much longer, your stepsisters will invent an even worse story about why you are hiding." Elira let herself be pulled a few steps back into the light of the hall, though she kept careful distance from the center of the floor, where accidents were far more likely to happen to a girl already marked as clumsy. As they walked, Elira caught sight of a man near the wine table watching her with narrowed eyes. He was tall, sharply dressed in deep green, with a thin mustache and a smile that did not reach his eyes. Lord Grant Ashworth. She did not know him personally, but she had heard his name spoken in careful, wary tones by her father's old friends, always followed by a warning to keep her distance if their paths ever crossed. Tonight it seemed their paths had crossed. Lord Grant lifted his goblet toward her in a mocking salute, and Elira quickly looked away, unsettled by the attention of a man she did not know and did not trust. "Ignore him," Charlotte murmured, following her gaze. "Lord Grant enjoys making people uncomfortable. It is practically his favorite pastime, second only to gambling away money that is not his." "Why does he keep looking at me?" Charlotte hesitated, and that hesitation told Elira more than any answer could have. "I could not say for certain, but I have heard whispers that he has taken a great interest in the Duke's affairs lately. Perhaps he has simply noticed that the Duke has taken an interest in you." Elira's stomach turned cold. "The Duke has not taken any interest in me. He watched me drop a goblet and make a fool of myself, that is all." "If you say so," Charlotte said, though her tone suggested she believed otherwise. The music shifted into something slower, and couples began to pair off for the next dance. Elira had no intention of joining them, not after the entrance she had already made. But before she could retreat further into the shadows, a servant in the Duke's livery approached her with a small, folded piece of parchment in his gloved hand. "For you, my lady," he said quietly, and pressed it into her palm before disappearing back into the crowd. Elira stared down at the parchment as if it might burn her fingers. Charlotte leaned in close, curious, but Elira turned slightly away and unfolded it herself, her heart pounding in her chest. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and unfamiliar, and the words themselves were simple, but they struck Elira with the force of a struck bell. "Meet me in the East Corridor before the second dance ends. Come alone. There is something you must know, and it cannot wait until the feast is over." There was no signature, but Elira did not need one. She had seen the Duke's own crest pressed into the wax seal that had been broken to send it, the very same crest that had been pressed into the letter her father's solicitor had read aloud after his death. Her fingers trembled slightly as she folded the parchment back into a small square and tucked it into the sleeve of her dress. "What does it say?" Charlotte asked, unable to hide her curiosity any longer. "Nothing important," Elira lied, though her voice wavered just enough that Charlotte raised an eyebrow in polite disbelief. Across the hall, Beatrice and Nora had gathered a small audience of young nobles around them. and Alira could hear fragments of their conversation drifting through the noise of the crowd. "Honestly, father only took her in because our own mother insisted," Beatrice was saying, tossing her dark curls over one shoulder. "She has never belonged among people like us. You saw how she nearly ruined the whole feast before it had even properly begun." "At least she keeps things interesting," one of the young nobles said with a chuckle, and Alira felt the heat rise in her cheeks all over again. She wanted, more than anything, to disappear into the stone walls of the castle and never emerge again. But the folded parchment pressed against her wrist reminded her that something far larger than her own humiliation was moving quietly beneath the surface of this glittering, cruel evening, and she could not afford to hide, not tonight. The second dance began, a slow, formal piece that drew nearly every couple in the hall onto the floor, and Alira used the movement of the crowd as cover to slip toward the edge of the room, toward the tall archway that led out into the east corridor. Charlotte caught her wrist gently before she could disappear. "Be careful," Charlotte said, her earlier lightness gone, replaced by something more serious. "Whatever that note said, be careful." Alira squeezed her friend's hand in silent thanks and slipped out of the hall. The corridor beyond was dim and quiet after the blazing light and noise of the feast, lit only by a few flickering torches set into iron brackets along the stone walls. The music from the hall grew muffled behind her, replaced by the soft echo of her own footsteps against the floor. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how alone she was, how far from anyone who might help her if this had all been some cruel trick arranged by Beatrice and Nora to embarrass her even further. But when a figure stepped out from the shadow of a stone archway ahead of her, she recognized him immediately, and her breath caught in her throat. Duke Julian Ambervale stood before her, no longer surrounded by courtiers and advisors, no longer wearing the careful, unreadable mask he had worn at the high table. In the low torchlight, he looked younger than she had realized, and far more tired. "You came," he said quietly. "You knew I would," Alira answered, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Or you would not have sent the note." A faint, almost reluctant smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I suppose that is true. Lady Voss, there are things you deserve to know before this night goes any further, and I have waited far too long already to tell you." Alira's heart pounded so loudly, she was certain he could hear it in the quiet corridor. Whatever secret this powerful, watchful man had carried through an entire feast without letting it show on his face, she sensed that once it was spoken aloud, nothing in her life would ever be quite the same again. Behind her, faint and half swallowed by the stone walls, she heard the echo of Beatrice's laughter drifting from the hall, and she wondered with a strange, cold certainty whether that laughter would still sound so confident once the truth finally came to light. Julian Ambervale did not speak right away. He glanced past Alira's shoulder toward the archway that led back into the hall, as though checking that no one had followed her, and then he stepped further into the shadows, gesturing for her to join him near a narrow window that looked out over the dark castle gardens. "I owe you an apology first," he said, "for staying silent tonight while your own stepsisters mocked you in front of my entire court, and while I sat at that table and did nothing to stop it." Alira blinked, caught off guard. Of everything she had imagined he might say, an apology had not been among the possibilities. "You are the Duke, my lord. You are not responsible for the manners of your guests." "Perhaps not," he said, "but I am responsible for the truth, and tonight I let a lie stand in its place. Everyone in that hall believes you are simply a minor lord's daughter, invited out of courtesy because your family holds a distant tie to mine. That is not the truth, Lady Voss, and I think you already suspect as much." Alira's hands tightened around the edge of her own sleeves. "My father left me a letter, read to me after he passed by his solicitor. It spoke of an arrangement made with a family of much higher standing. I was never given a name." "The name was mine," Julian said quietly. "Your father and my own father signed that agreement nearly 2 years ago, before either of our fathers passed within months of one another. I have known your name, Lady Voss, since the letter naming you as my intended bride first reached me 6 months past." For a long moment, Alira could not speak at all. The torchlight seemed to waver and blur at the edges of her vision, and she pressed one hand flat against the cool stone wall to steady herself. "You have known for 6 months," she finally managed, "and you said nothing. You let me walk into that hall tonight as a stranger, as someone to be laughed at, when you already knew." "I know how it must look," Julian said, and for the first time that evening, something like genuine regret crossed his face. "But you must understand the position I have been in since my father's death. There are men in that hall tonight who would use this arrangement against me the moment they learned of it. Men who believe a duke's marriage should serve alliances of wealth and power, not a promise made in ink between two lords who are no longer alive to defend it." Alira thought immediately of Lord Grant Ashworth, the man with the thin mustache and the mocking salute, and something cold settled in her stomach. "Lord Grant," she said slowly. "He looked at me tonight as though he already suspected something." Julian's expression darkened. "Lord Grant has spent the better part of a year trying to arrange a marriage between myself and his own niece, a match that would bring his family considerable influence over Ambervale lands. If he learns the truth about our betrothal before I am ready to announce it, he will not simply accept defeat quietly. He is not a man who loses gracefully, Lady Voss, and I fear what lengths he might go to in order to prevent this marriage from ever taking place." "Then why summon me here at all?" Alira asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "Why risk revealing any of this tonight, in a corridor, where anyone might stumble upon us?" Julian was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the flickering torchlight as though searching for something there. "Because I watched you drop that goblet tonight, and I watched an entire room of people who should have known better laugh at you without a shred of kindness. And I realized that I could not sit at that table for one more hour, hiding behind silence, while you carried the weight of humiliation that was never truly yours to carry. You deserve to know the truth, even if only in private, even if only for tonight." Alira felt something shift inside her chest, a strange mixture of anger and relief, and something else she did not yet have a name for. "The truth does not undo what happened in that hall, my lord. It does not erase the laughter or the names they have already given me." "No," Julian admitted. "It does not, but it can change what happens next if you will allow it to." Before Alira could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor, quick and purposeful, and both of them turned toward the archway with matching expressions of alarm. Julian stepped back smoothly, putting a respectful distance between them just as a figure rounded the corner. It was not Lord Grant, as Alira had feared, but an older man with silver hair and sharp, watchful eyes, dressed in the deep burgundy robes of a castle steward. He stopped short at the sight of them, and his gaze flicked briefly between the Duke and Alira with an expression that suggested he understood far more than he let on. "Your Grace," the steward said, bowing his head, "forgive the interruption. Lord Ashworth has been asking after you rather insistently, and I thought it best to find you before he decided to search the corridors himself." "Thank you, Whitfield," Julian said, his voice returning instantly to the calm, measured tone of a man in complete control, though Alira could see the tension still lingering in his shoulders. "Tell Lord Ashworth I will rejoin the feast shortly." Whitfield's eyes moved once more to Alira, lingering just a moment too long to be entirely accidental, before he offered another shallow bow and disappeared back down the corridor. Alira let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Does he know?" she asked quietly once they were alone again. "Whitfield has served my family since before I was born," Julian said. "He knows more secrets about Ambervale than perhaps even I do. I trust him, though I have not told him everything either. It is safer, for now, if as few people as possible know the truth before I am ready to make it known publicly." "And when will that be?" Alira asked. "How long am I meant to endure being laughed at, while the truth sits hidden in a locked letter and a private corridor?" Julian's jaw tightened, and for a moment Alira thought she saw something like frustration flicker across his face, though whether it was directed at her or at the situation itself, she could not say. "I need time to secure my position within the court before I make this announcement. Lord Grant has allies among the older families, men who have questioned my authority since the moment I inherited this title. If I announce our betrothal too soon, without the proper support behind me, he could turn enough of the court against the marriage to cause serious trouble for both of us." Elira wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling very small and very tired. "So I am meant to return to that feast and continue being mocked, knowing the truth, but unable to speak it." "I know it is not fair," Julian said, his voice softer now. "And I know I have no right to ask this of you, not after tonight, not after everything your stepsisters have already put you through. But I am asking, Lady Voss, a little more patience, a little more time. I promise you, when the truth is finally revealed, it will be revealed in a way that leaves no room for anyone in that hall to mock you ever again." Elira studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of deception, any hint that this was simply another cruel trick disguised as kindness. But there was nothing in his expression but quiet, earnest sincerity, and something in her chest softened despite her better judgment. "How much time?" she asked finally. "A fortnight," Julian said. "Perhaps less if circumstances allow it. I have already begun quiet conversations with families whose support I will need. Once I have secured enough of them, I will announce our betrothal before the full court, and Lord Grant will have no choice but to accept it." "And if he does not accept it," Elira pressed, "you said yourself he is not a man who loses gracefully." Julian's expression turned grim. "Then we will deal with that when it comes. But I would rather face his anger with the full support of my court behind me than risk exposing you to his schemes before I am prepared to protect you properly." Elira did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all, simply nodding slowly as the weight of everything he had told her settled fully into place. A fortnight of silence, a fortnight of mockery, endured for the sake of a promise made by two men who were no longer alive to see it through. "I should return to the hall," she said finally, "before my absence draws more attention than I can afford." "Of course," Julian said, and then, after a brief hesitation, he added, "Thank you, Lady Voss, for your patience tonight and for the patience I am asking of you still. I do not take it lightly." Elira offered him a small, uncertain smile, the first genuine smile she had managed since arriving at the feast, and turned to make her way back toward the archway. But before she had taken more than a few steps, Julian spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "For what it is worth, I did not find you clumsy tonight, Lady Voss. I found you remarkably brave to walk back into that hall with your head held high after everything they said." Elira paused, glancing back at him over her shoulder, and for a moment the torchlight caught something warm and genuine in his dark eyes that made her chest tighten in a way she did not fully understand. "Good night, Your Grace," she said softly, and slipped back through the archway before he could see how deeply his words had affected her. The hall was just as loud and bright as she had left it, the music still playing, the couples still spinning across the polished floor, and for a moment Elira simply stood at the edge of the crowd, watching it all with new eyes. Somewhere in that glittering room, Beatrice and Nora were still laughing at her expense, still enjoying a joke that Elira alone knew was built on a foundation of lies neither of them understood. Charlotte found her within moments, her expression a mixture of relief and burning curiosity. "You are pale as a ghost. What happened out there?" "Nothing I can explain tonight," Elira said, and though it pained her to withhold the truth from the one person who had shown her genuine kindness, she knew she had no other choice. Across the hall, near the wine table, Lord Grant Ashworth watched the archway Elira had just emerged from with narrowed, calculating eyes, his earlier mocking smile now replaced by something far more dangerous. He had seen the Duke slip away from the feast not long before, and he had noticed, with great interest, that the clumsy Voss girl had disappeared from the hall at almost precisely the same time. He raised his goblet to his lips, hiding the small, cold smile that spread across his face, and began quietly to plan. 3 days after the feast, Elira sat in the small study of her family's modest manor house, staring at a stack of unpaid accounts without truly seeing any of the numbers written on them. Since her father's passing, the running of the household had fallen mostly to her, though her stepmother preferred to spend her days overseeing Beatrice and Nora's endless preparations for whatever social gathering came next, leaving the actual burden of managing what little money remained to Alira alone. A knock at the study door pulled her from her thoughts, and Charlotte Marrow let herself in without waiting for an answer, a habit she had never quite broken since the two of them had become close friends years earlier. "You have been hiding in this house for 3 days," Charlotte said, settling into the chair across from Alira's desk. "I began to worry the feast had done more damage than a broken goblet." Alira managed a tired smile. "I have simply had a great deal to think about." "About the note," Charlotte said, not quite a question, "and whatever happened in that corridor." Alira hesitated. She trusted Charlotte more than almost anyone, but Julian's warning echoed in her mind, the danger of the truth spreading too soon, reaching the wrong ears before he was ready. "I cannot tell you everything," she admitted finally. "Not yet. But I promise, when I am able, you will be among the first to know." Charlotte studied her for a long moment, and to her credit she did not press further, though curiosity clearly burned behind her eyes. "Then I will trust you to keep your promise. In the meantime, I have news of my own that might interest you." "What sort of news?" "Word has spread through the merchant quarter that Duke Ambervale has been meeting privately with several of the older noble families this week. Lord Fairweather, Lady Prescott, even old Baron Ellsworth, who has not left his own estate for a social visit in over a year. No one seems to know what the meetings are about, but the timing seems rather curious, does it not, given everything that happened at the feast?" Alira's heart quickened, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. Julian was doing exactly what he had promised, quietly building the support he would need before making their betrothal known. "Perhaps he is simply attending to matters of the estate," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Perhaps," Charlotte said, clearly unconvinced but willing to let the matter rest. "There is other news as well, though this piece concerns Lord Ashworth, and I confess it troubles me more." "What about him?" "He has been seen at your own family's manor gates twice this week, though he never actually calls upon the house. My brother saw him passing near the servants' entrance late in the evening 2 nights ago, speaking quietly with someone from your household staff. When my brother approached to greet him, Lord Ashworth left rather abruptly, without so much as a proper farewell." A cold unease settled over Alira. "Which servant was he speaking with? Did your brother recognize them?" "He could not say for certain in the dark," Charlotte admitted. "But I thought you should know. A man like Lord Grant Ashworth does not visit servants' entrances without a reason, and I doubt that reason has anything to do with kindness." Alira thought immediately of Julian's warning in the corridor, the danger Lord Grant posed if he learned the truth before the Duke was ready to reveal it. If Lord Grant was already making inquiries among her own household staff, it meant he suspected something, and suspicion in the hands of a man like that could prove every bit as dangerous as certainty. "Thank you for telling me," Alira said quietly. "I will speak with the staff myself carefully and see what I can learn." That evening, after Charlotte had gone home and the manor had settled into its usual quiet, Alira sought out Margaret, the elderly housekeeper who had served her family since before Alira was born, and who had remained fiercely loyal even through the difficult years following her father's death. She found Margaret in the small kitchen at the back of the manor, mending a torn apron by candlelight, and the older woman looked up with obvious surprise at Alira's late visit. "My lady, is something troubling you? You have that same look your father used to get, right before he had bad news to share." Alira sat down across from her at the worn wooden table, choosing her words carefully. "Margaret, has anyone from outside the household approached you recently, asking questions about me or about my father's affairs?" Margaret's needle paused mid-stitch, and something flickered across her weathered face that told Alira she had guessed correctly. "There was a man, my lady. Came round 2 nights past, dressed finer than any visitor we usually see at that entrance. Did not give his name, but he asked after your father's old papers. Letters, contracts, that sort of thing. offered good coin for anyone willing to look through the study and bring him whatever they could find. Elira's blood ran cold. What did you tell him? Told him I did not know what he was talking about, and that he ought to leave before I called for the stable hands, Margaret said, her chin lifting with obvious pride. But my lady, I fear he may try again, perhaps with someone less loyal than myself. There are one or two among the younger staff who have grumbled about their wages of late, and a man offering good coin might find a more willing ear elsewhere. Did he say anything else? Anything about why he wanted those papers? Margaret shook her head slowly. Only that it concerned a matter of great importance, and that time was short. I did not like the look of him, my lady, if you will forgive my saying so. Sharp eyes, and a smile that did not sit right on his face. Elira did not need to ask for a description. She already knew, with a sick certainty, exactly who Margaret was describing. "Thank you, Margaret," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze the older woman's hand. "Please, if he or anyone else comes asking again, tell me immediately. And Margaret, I need you to help me move something, tonight, quietly, before anyone else in the household notices." Together, working by the light of a single candle, Elira and Margaret carefully gathered every letter, contract, and document related to her father's affairs from the study, wrapping them in a length of old cloth, and carrying them up to Elira's own bedchamber, where she hid them beneath a loose floorboard her father had shown her as a child, back when such hiding places had seemed like nothing more than a game between them. It was well past midnight by the time Elira finally settled into bed, but sleep did not come easily. Her mind raced through everything she had learned that day, the Duke's quiet meetings with the older families, Lord Grant's suspicious inquiries at her own household gates, the fragile secret balanced between them all like a candle flame in a room full of open windows. She thought of Julian's promise in the corridor, a fortnight of patience in exchange for a truth that would silence every laugh, every cruel whisper, every mocking name her stepsisters had given her. But a fortnight suddenly felt like a very long time indeed, if Lord Grant Ashworth was already circling closer than any of them had anticipated. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the manor, though not one Elira had been expecting. A carriage bearing the Ambervale crest arrived shortly after breakfast, and Elira watched from an upstairs window, her heart pounding, as a footman helped an elegant older woman step down onto the gravel drive below. By the time Elira made her way downstairs, her stepmother had already ushered the visitor into the sitting room, practically glowing with the honor of hosting anyone connected to the Duke's household, even as Beatrice and Nora hovered nearby, eager to make a good impression. "Lady Voss," the visitor said warmly, rising to greet Elira as she entered the room. She was perhaps 60 years of age, with silver hair swept elegantly beneath a fine hat, and kind eyes that seemed to take in far more than they let on. "Forgive the unannounced visit. I am Lady Prescott, an old friend of the Ambervale family, and I hoped I might have a private word with you if your family will permit it." Elira's stepmother practically pushed her forward, clearly thrilled at the prospect of whatever favor this connection might bring the family, and within moments Elira found herself alone with Lady Prescott in the small garden behind the manor, well out of earshot of the house. "You must be wondering why I have come," Lady Prescott said, once they were settled on a stone bench beneath an old oak tree. "I confess I am, my lady." "The Duke asked me to call upon you," Lady Prescott said gently, though he could not risk visiting himself without drawing far too much attention. "I have known Julian since he was a boy in short trousers, running through his father's gardens without a care in the world. He trusts very few people with matters of importance, and I am honored that he has trusted me with this one." "What did he ask you to tell me?" "That his meetings this week have gone well. Baron Ellsworth and Lord Fairweather have both pledged their support for the betrothal once it is announced. Lady Prescott herself, that is to say, myself, has pledged the same. It is not the full court yet, but it is a strong foundation, stronger than he had hoped for so soon." Relief washed over Elira, though it was tempered almost immediately by the memory of the previous night's discovery. "My lady," there is something you should know as well. Lord Grant Ashworth has been making inquiries at my family's manor, asking servants to search for my father's private papers. I fear he may already suspect something." Lady Prescott's expression sharpened, all warmth momentarily replaced by careful calculation. "That is troubling news indeed. Lord Grant is not a patient man, and if he suspects the truth before Julian is ready to announce it, he will not wait quietly for confirmation. He will act, and he will act in whatever way causes the most damage possible. What should I do?" "For now, continue exactly as you have been," Lady Prescott said. "Keep your father's papers hidden and secure. Say nothing to anyone outside this garden about what you have told me today. I will carry this news to Julian myself, and he will decide how best to proceed. But Lady Voss, I must ask you something important, and I need you to answer honestly." "Of course." "Do you trust him? Julian, I mean. Not the Duke, not the title, but the man himself." Elira thought of the corridor, the torchlight, the quiet sincerity in his voice as he had apologized for his silence, the warmth in his eyes as he had called her brave. "I do," she said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. Lady Prescott smiled, the first truly warm smile she had offered since arriving. "Good, because in the days ahead, that trust may be tested more than either of you expect. Lord Grant will not simply disappear because a few old families have pledged their support. Men like him grow more dangerous, not less, when they sense their influence slipping away." As Lady Prescott's carriage rolled back down the drive a short while later, Elira stood at the window of her bedchamber, watching until it disappeared from sight, and found herself thinking, with a strange mixture of hope and dread, that whatever was coming next would arrive far sooner than a fortnight. She was right to worry. That very evening, as the household settled into its usual quiet routine, one of the younger stable hands slipped away from the manor grounds under cover of darkness, a small leather pouch of coins hidden in his coat pocket, and made his way toward a private meeting that would set in motion everything Elira had feared since the moment Margaret first described the sharp-eyed stranger at the servants' gate. Lord Grant Ashworth received the stable hand in a private room above a tavern on the edge of town, far from the prying eyes of the nobility who might recognize either of them together. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp on a scarred wooden table, and Lord Grant sat with his fingers steepled, watching the nervous young man shift from foot to foot with obvious discomfort. "You have brought me nothing," Lord Grant said flatly, once the stable hand had finished his stammering report. "No papers, no proof, only a story about an old housekeeper who chased you off before you could search the study properly." "I tried, my lord, truly I did," the young man said. "But the housekeeper watches everything, and the young lady herself she has taken to locking her own bedchamber door at night, which she never used to do before." Lord Grant's eyes narrowed. That small detail told him more than the young man likely realized. A girl with nothing to hide had no reason to suddenly guard her privacy so carefully. Something had changed at that manor, and Lord Grant intended to discover exactly what. "Very well," he said, sliding a small pouch of coins across the table, though noticeably lighter than the one he had promised for actual proof. "Keep watching. Report anything unusual, anything at all, and there will be more coin waiting for you." Once the stable hand had gone, slipping back out into the night to return to the manor before his absence was noticed, Lord Grant remained alone in the dim room, turning the pieces of what he already knew over in his mind like a merchant counting coins. The Duke had disappeared from his own feast at precisely the same moment the clumsy Voss girl had slipped away. He had spent the days since meeting privately with old families whose support he had never bothered to court before, families whose favor mattered a great deal when it came to matters of marriage and inheritance. And now, apparently, the girl herself had grown suddenly cautious, guarding papers she had never bothered to guard before. It did not take a genius to draw the obvious conclusion, though Lord Grant needed more than suspicion. He needed proof, something undeniable he could use to force the Duke's hand, or better still, something he could use to poison the court's opinion of the match before it was even announced. He thought of his niece, Vivienne, waiting patiently at her family estate for the marriage he had promised her, a marriage that would secure his own influence over Ambervale lands for a generation to come. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much political capital arranging that future, to watch it slip away because of some forgotten contract between two dead lords and their overlooked daughter. Lord Grant smiled coldly into the dim lamplight and began once again to plan. Meanwhile, at the Voss manor, Beatrice and Nora had begun to notice a change in their stepsister that neither of them could quite explain, though it irritated them both in equal measure. "She has stopped flinching," Nora complained one afternoon, watching Alira cross the garden below their window with a steadiness in her stride that had never been there before the feast. "Do you remember how she used to go pale whenever we mentioned the feast? Now she simply smiles and walks away." "Perhaps she has finally accepted her place," Beatrice said dismissively, though there was an edge of uncertainty in her voice that suggested she did not fully believe her own words. "Or perhaps something happened that night we do not know about," Nora said slowly. "She disappeared during the second dance. I noticed, though I said nothing at the time. And that steward, the one who serves the Duke directly, he has visited this house twice this week, always asking to speak privately with Margaret in the kitchen." Beatrice's eyes narrowed with sudden sharp interest. "Twice." "Twice," Nora confirmed. "And each time Margaret grows tight-lipped and refuses to say what was discussed." The two stepsisters exchanged a long look, the kind of silent communication built over years of shared scheming, and Beatrice's mouth curved into a slow, calculating smile. "We should find out what our clumsy sister is hiding," she said. "If there is some connection between her and the Duke's household, we deserve to know about it before it becomes a problem for either of us." That evening, Beatrice waited until the household had settled into its usual quiet, then slipped down the corridor toward Alira's bedchamber, testing the door handle carefully. As Margaret had confirmed, it was locked, a fact that only deepened Beatrice's suspicion. She pressed her ear against the wood for a long moment, listening for any sound of movement within, but heard nothing beyond the faint, steady breathing of someone already asleep. Frustrated, Beatrice made her way instead toward the small study where their father's old papers had once been kept, hoping to find some clue there instead, only to discover the shelves and drawers largely empty, stripped of anything that might have once held significance. "Someone has already been here," she murmured to herself, running her fingers along an empty shelf where a stack of old letters had once sat gathering dust, back when no one in the household had thought them important enough to hide. She returned to her own bedchamber that night with more questions than answers, but with a growing, uneasy certainty that her stepsister was involved in something far larger than any of them had originally suspected, something that might, if handled correctly, prove very useful indeed to a family always looking for ways to climb higher in the world. The following day, an invitation arrived at the Voss manor that sent the entire household into a flurry of excitement, all except for Alira, who read the elegant, embossed card with a growing sense of dread rather than delight. Duke Julian Ambervale was hosting a private garden gathering at the end of the week, a smaller, more intimate affair than the grand feast, intended, according to the invitation, to strengthen bonds between the noble families of the region ahead of the coming season. The Voss family, along with a select handful of others, had been formally invited to attend. "This is wonderful news," Alira's stepmother declared, clutching the invitation to her chest as though it were made of solid gold. "An intimate gathering means far fewer distractions, and far greater opportunity for Beatrice or Nora to catch the Duke's proper attention at last." Beatrice and Nora immediately began discussing which gowns to wear, which conversations to prepare, which clever remarks might finally win the Duke's favor where the grand feast had failed. Alira sat quietly through the excited chatter, saying nothing, though her mind raced with a very different set of concerns entirely. If Julian was hosting a smaller, more private gathering so soon after their conversation in the corridor, it likely meant he intended to use the occasion to further solidify support among the families he had already courted, perhaps even to take another quiet step toward revealing their betrothal. But it also meant Lord Grant Ashworth would almost certainly be present as well, watching, waiting, searching for any small slip that might confirm his growing suspicions. She found a private moment later that evening to write a short note of her own, sealing it carefully and entrusting it to Margaret to be delivered discreetly to Lady Prescott's household the following morning. In it, she shared what little she knew of Beatrice's growing suspicions, and asked, as delicately as she could manage, whether the timing of the garden gathering was truly wise, given everything Lord Grant already seemed to suspect. The response came 2 days later, carried by the same quiet footman who had delivered Julian's original note during the feast. It was brief, written in Julian's own elegant hand. The gathering must proceed as planned. Too much has already been set in motion to delay now. I understand the risk, and I promise you I have taken precautions. Trust me a little longer, Lady Voss. We are closer to the truth than you know. Alira read the note 3 times before finally tucking it away with the others, hidden beneath the same loose floorboard that held her father's precious documents. She wanted, desperately, to trust him completely, to believe that whatever precautions he had taken would be enough to protect them both from a man as calculating and dangerous as Lord Grant Ashworth. But as the day of the garden gathering approached, and as she noticed Beatrice watching her with new, sharpened interest across the dinner table each evening, Alira could not entirely shake the feeling that they were all walking, slowly and deliberately, straight into a trap that Lord Grant had been quietly building since the very night the goblet first slipped from her fingers. The morning of the gathering arrived clear and bright, with a soft breeze drifting through the manor's open windows as Alira dressed carefully in a pale blue gown, simpler than her stepsister's elaborate creations, but chosen deliberately to draw as little attention as possible. Margaret helped fasten the final buttons at her back, her weathered hands steady despite the tension Alira could sense radiating from her. "Be careful today, my lady," Margaret said quietly, meeting Alira's eyes in the small mirror above her dressing table. "Whatever is coming, I have a feeling in my bones that today will bring it closer." Alira reached back to squeeze the older woman's hand, drawing what comfort she could from the familiar gesture. "I will be careful, Margaret. I promise." But as the family carriage rolled through the castle gates a short while later, and as Alira caught sight of Lord Grant Ashworth already standing among the assembled guests in the sunlit garden, his sharp eyes finding hers almost immediately across the crowd, she felt Margaret's warning settle over her like a shadow she could not quite shake, no matter how tightly she held her composure. The garden gathering had only just begun, and already, Alira sensed, the careful balance Julian had worked so hard to build was about to be tested in ways none of them had fully prepared for. The garden behind Ambervale Castle had been transformed for the occasion, with rows of white pavilions set among the hedges and roses, small tables draped in fine linen scattered across the lawn, and musicians playing softly enough that conversation could flow easily beneath the melody rather than being drowned out by it. It was, by every measure, a far more intimate affair than the grand feast, exactly as the invitation had promised. Alira stayed close to her stepmother and stepsisters as they made their way through the gathering, offering polite nods to the handful of families she recognized, though her eyes kept drifting, almost against her will, toward the small cluster of guests surrounding Duke Julian near the center of the garden. He looked entirely composed, laughing politely at something Baron Ellsworth had said, though Alira could see, from the careful set of his shoulders, that he was just as aware of her arrival as she was of his. "There he is," Nora murmured beside her, straightening her posture and smoothing the front of her elaborate gown. "Beatrice, this is our chance. Fewer guests means fewer distractions." Beatrice nodded, already composing whatever clever remark she intended to use to catch the Duke's attention, and the two of them drifted toward the crowd surrounding him, leaving Alira momentarily alone near the edge of the garden. She had barely a moment to breathe before Charlotte appeared at her side, looking uncharacteristically tense despite the warm sunshine and pleasant surroundings. "You look as though you would rather be anywhere else," Charlotte observed quietly. Perhaps I would, Alira admitted, keeping her voice low. There is a great deal happening today that I cannot fully explain. I noticed Lord Ashworth watching you the moment your carriage arrived, Charlotte said. He has not stopped since. I do not like it, Alira. Neither do I, Alira said honestly, glancing across the garden to where Lord Grant stood near the refreshment table, his expression outwardly relaxed as he chatted with another guest, though his eyes flicked toward Alira with unsettling regularity. Before Charlotte could press further, Lady Prescott appeared beside them both, her elegant presence immediately drawing polite attention from the surrounding guests, though she managed the introductions with such practiced ease that no one seemed to think anything unusual about her singling out Alira for conversation. "Lady Voss," she said warmly, "I wonder if you might walk with me a moment. I have been meaning to show someone the new roses along the eastern hedge, and I find I have quite forgotten which variety Lady Marrow's own gardens boast this season." It was a flimsy excuse, and Alira suspected everyone within earshot understood as much, but Charlotte simply smiled knowingly and stepped back, allowing Lady Prescott to guide Alira away from the main gathering toward the quieter eastern edge of the garden. Once they were safely out of earshot, Lady Prescott's warm smile faded into something far more serious. "Julian asked me to speak with you before he has the chance to do so himself. There has been a development you should know about before it becomes public." Alira's stomach tightened. "What sort of development?" "Baron Ellsworth has agreed to publicly support the betrothal, but only under one condition. He wishes for Julian to present proof of the original contract to the assembled court, rather than simply announcing the betrothal on his word alone. He fears, given Lord Grant's growing influence, that an announcement without proof could be challenged and dismissed as mere rumor, no matter how true it may be." "My father's letter," Alira said slowly, "the one naming Julian as my intended husband." "Precisely," Lady Prescott confirmed. "Julian believes you may still have that letter, or perhaps other documents connected to it, hidden somewhere among your father's affairs. If you do, he needs them, and soon, before Lord Grant's own suspicions harden into something he can act upon." Alira thought immediately of the hidden floorboard in her bedchamber, the careful bundle of papers she and Margaret had moved there in the dead of night. "I have them," she said quietly, "hidden safely at the manor." Relief flickered across Lady Prescott's face. "Good. Julian will need to arrange a way to have them delivered discreetly, without drawing attention from your stepsisters or, worse, from Lord Grant himself. Can you manage that, do you think?" "I believe so," Alira said, though uncertainty crept into her voice even as she spoke. "But my stepsister Beatrice has grown suspicious already. She searched my father's study recently and found it stripped bare. If she notices me handling anything unusual today, it may only deepen her curiosity." "Then we shall have to be very careful indeed," Lady Prescott said, glancing back toward the main gathering, where Beatrice and Nora had successfully inserted themselves into the circle surrounding Julian, both of them laughing a touch too loudly at whatever amusing remark had just been made. "Julian will find a moment to speak with you properly before the afternoon ends. Until then, simply enjoy the gathering as best you can, and trust that we are all working toward the same end." Lady Prescott guided them both back toward the main crowd shortly after, seamlessly rejoining the flow of conversation, as though their private discussion had never happened at all. Alira found herself seated at a small table near the edge of the lawn a short while later, sharing polite conversation with an elderly baroness, who seemed far more interested in discussing the unusually warm weather than anything of actual consequence, which suited Alira perfectly well, given the racing thoughts still churning beneath her calm exterior. It was nearly an hour later, as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the surrounding hills, that Alira noticed Lord Grant Ashworth rise from his own table and make his way, with deliberate casualness, toward where Beatrice and Nora stood near the rose hedges. Curiosity and a growing sense of unease drew Alira closer, though she was careful to keep enough distance that her presence would not seem obvious. She positioned herself near a nearby pavilion, close enough to catch fragments of the conversation carried on the light afternoon breeze. "Your stepsister seems to have caught the Duke's particular interest of late," Lord Grant was saying smoothly, his voice pitched just loud enough for Alira to hear, though clearly meant primarily for Beatrice's ears. "Curious, given how little attention she received at the grand feast. One wonders what might have changed so quickly." "I have wondered the same thing myself, my lord," Beatrice replied, her tone carefully measured, though Alira could hear the sharp interest lurking beneath the polite surface. "She has become rather secretive of late, locked doors, hidden papers. It is all very strange for a girl who has never had anything worth hiding before." Alira's blood ran cold. Beatrice had noticed far more than she had realized. "Is that so?" Lord Grant said, his voice dropping slightly, though Alira could still catch the words if she strained to listen. "Lady Voss, I find myself curious about your late father's affairs. I understand he made certain arrangements before his passing, arrangements that were perhaps never fully disclosed to the rest of his family." Beatrice's eyes widened slightly, sharp interest flaring into something closer to genuine excitement. "What sort of arrangements, my lord?" "That I am afraid I cannot say with certainty," Lord Grant said, and Alira could hear the practiced regret in his voice, the deliberate performance of a man carefully planting seeds he intended to watch grow. "But if you were to discover anything of interest among your stepsister's private belongings, I would consider it a great favor if you brought such information directly to me, before sharing it more broadly. Discretion, you understand, protects everyone involved, including your own family's reputation." "Of course, my lord," Beatrice said, and Alira could hear the calculating pleasure in her stepsister's voice, the sense of a valuable opportunity being handed to her on a silver platter. "I will keep a careful eye on her." Alira slipped away from the pavilion before either of them could notice her presence, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. Lord Grant had just recruited her own stepsister as an unwitting spy, and Beatrice, driven by jealousy and ambition in equal measure, seemed only too eager to accept the role. She found Julian a short while later, seated at the head table with several older nobles, and caught his eye just long enough to convey, through careful, deliberate glances, that something urgent needed to be discussed. He excused himself smoothly a few minutes later, making his way toward a quiet stretch of garden near the eastern hedge, where Alira followed at a discreet distance. "You look troubled," Julian said quietly once they were alone. "Lord Grant has recruited Beatrice," Alira said, keeping her voice low and urgent. "He asked her to search my belongings for anything unusual, anything connected to my father's affairs. She has already noticed my locked door, the empty study. I fear it is only a matter of time before she finds something, or before Lord Grant grows impatient and takes matters into his own hands." Julian's expression darkened, the careful composure he had maintained throughout the gathering slipping into something far more serious. "Then we cannot wait any longer. Lady Prescott told you of Baron Ellsworth's condition." "She did. I have the letter and the other papers hidden safely for now." "I need them within the next 2 days," Julian said. "I will send Whitfield to collect them personally, someone Lord Grant would never think to suspect. Once I have proof in hand, I can present it to the full council and force the matter into the open before Lord Grant has any further opportunity to interfere. And if he learns of it before then, if Beatrice finds something first—" Julian's jaw tightened. "Then we will simply have to move faster than either of them expects. Lady Voss, I am sorry to ask this of you, given everything you have already endured, but I need you to trust me a little longer still. We are very close now." "Closer than Lord Grant realizes." Alira looked into his dark, earnest eyes, and despite the fear coiling tight in her chest, she found herself nodding once again, the same quiet trust she had offered in the torch-lit corridor now steadying her against the growing danger swirling around them both. "I trust you," she said softly, "but please be careful. Beatrice is watching me closely now, and I fear she will not hesitate to use whatever she finds against me if it means winning favor with Lord Grant." "I will be careful," Julian promised. "And I promise you this as well, Lady Voss. Whatever happens in the days ahead, I will not allow Lord Grant Ashworth or your own stepsister to use you as a pawn in their schemes. Not while I have breath left to stop them. As the garden gathering wound down that evening, and the Voss family carriage began its journey back toward the manor beneath a sky streaked with orange and violet, Alira caught Beatrice watching her with a new, calculating intensity that sent a fresh chill down her spine. Whatever fragile peace had existed between them before tonight, Alira understood now, with painful clarity, that it had been shattered entirely, replaced by something far more dangerous, a race against time that neither she nor Julian could afford to lose. The night after the garden gathering, Alira lay awake long past midnight, listening to the familiar sounds of the manor settling around her, the creak of old wood, the distant hoot of an owl somewhere beyond her window, the faint rustle of wind through the trees lining the drive. Sleep would not come, not with Beatrice's newfound suspicion pressing on her thoughts like a stone she could not set down. She had agreed to have Whitfield collect her father's papers within 2 days, but every hour that passed now felt like a risk, a window in which Beatrice might discover the hiding place before the steward ever arrived. Alira finally rose from her bed sometime after midnight, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and knelt beside the loose floorboard to check, for perhaps the 3rd time that night, that the bundle remained exactly where she had left it. It did, undisturbed, and she allowed herself a small breath of relief before easing the board back into place and returning to bed, though true rest continued to elude her until the earliest gray light of dawn finally crept through her window. The following morning brought an unexpected complication. Alira's stepmother announced over breakfast that she had arranged a visit to the dressmaker in town, insisting that all 3 girls accompany her to be fitted for new gowns ahead of the coming social season. Alira tried gently to excuse herself, citing a headache, but her stepmother would hear none of it, and within the hour, Alira found herself seated uncomfortably in the family carriage alongside Beatrice and Nora, rattling toward town. It was, she realized with mounting dread, the perfect opportunity for someone to search her bedchamber undisturbed, and judging by the small, satisfied smile Beatrice wore throughout the carriage ride, Alira suspected her stepsister had arranged the entire outing for precisely that purpose. She spent the fitting distracted and anxious, barely registering the dressmaker's questions about fabric and color, her mind racing instead through every possible way Beatrice might have arranged to search the house while they were all safely occupied elsewhere. It was not until they arrived back at the manor late that afternoon that Alira's fears were confirmed in the worst possible way. Margaret met her at the door, her weathered face pale and drawn with worry. "My lady," she whispered urgently, drawing Alira aside before her stepmother and stepsisters had fully entered the house. "Someone was in your room today. I caught one of the younger maids leaving your chamber not an hour past, and when I asked what business she had there, she claimed she was simply tidying, though nothing needed tidying at all." Alira's stomach dropped. "The floorboard." "I checked myself the moment the maid left," Margaret said. "The papers are still there, undisturbed as far as I could tell, but my lady, I do not believe that girl was working alone. I have seen her speaking with your stepsister Beatrice more than once these past few days, always in quiet corners, always falling silent whenever I drew near." Alira's mind raced. If the maid had failed to find the hidden papers, it meant the hiding place itself remained secure, at least for now. But it also meant Beatrice's search had grown bold enough to involve bribing members of the household staff directly, a dangerous escalation that suggested Lord Grant's influence and his impatience were both growing. "Thank you, Margaret," Alira said, squeezing the older woman's hand. "I need to get word to the castle immediately. Julian, that is, the Duke, was meant to send someone to collect the papers within 2 days, but I fear we cannot wait that long now." That evening, Alira composed a hurried note by candlelight, explaining the day's events as plainly as she dared, and entrusted it once again to Margaret, who slipped out into the darkness to deliver it personally to a contact within the castle's outer gates, someone Margaret trusted to pass the message along quickly and discreetly. The response came far sooner than Alira had expected. Just past midnight, a soft knock sounded at her bedchamber window, startling her so badly she nearly knocked over her candle. She crossed the room cautiously and drew back the curtain to find Whitfield himself, the Duke's steward, standing on the narrow ledge outside her window, having apparently climbed a portion of the manor's outer trellis to reach her without passing through the main house at all. "Forgive the unusual method of arrival, my lady," Whitfield said quietly, once Alira had helped him through the window, his usually composed expression tight with urgency. "His Grace received your message and insisted I collect the documents tonight, rather than waiting the additional day as originally planned. He fears, given what you described, that further delay would be far too dangerous." Alira wasted no time retrieving the bundle of papers from beneath the floorboard, pressing them carefully into Whitfield's waiting hands. "Please, tell him to be careful. If Beatrice or Lord Grant learn these papers have left the house, they may suspect the truth immediately." "I will take every precaution, my lady," Whitfield promised, tucking the bundle securely inside his coat. "His Grace also asked me to relay a message. The council meeting has been moved forward. He intends to present the proof and announce the betrothal formally in 3 days' time, rather than waiting for the full fortnight originally planned. He felt it wiser to act now, while he still holds the advantage, rather than risk Lord Grant striking first." Alira's heart pounded with a mixture of relief and fresh anxiety. 3 days felt impossibly soon, and yet, given everything that had happened since the garden gathering, it also felt like none too soon at all. "Thank you," she said softly. "Please thank him for me as well." Whitfield offered a small, respectful bow before climbing back out through the window and disappearing into the darkness as silently as he had arrived, leaving Alira alone once more with her racing thoughts, and the empty space beneath the floorboard where her father's papers had rested for so many anxious days. The following morning, Beatrice cornered Alira in the upstairs hallway before breakfast, her expression carefully pleasant in a way that immediately set Alira on guard. "You seem tired this morning, sister," Beatrice said, her voice sweet in a manner that had never once been genuine between them. "Did you not sleep well?" "I slept fine," Alira said carefully, keeping her expression neutral despite the tension coiling tight in her chest. "How curious," Beatrice continued, studying Alira's face with sharp, searching eyes. "I could have sworn I heard voices near your window sometime past midnight. Perhaps I simply imagined it." Alira's blood ran cold, though she forced herself to remain outwardly calm. "Perhaps you did. This house does creak terribly at night." Beatrice's smile widened slightly, though it did not reach her eyes. "Of course. Well, I shall leave you to your mourning, sister. Do try to get some proper rest tonight. You would not want to embarrass yourself again in front of important company, would you?" She swept past Alira toward the stairs, and Alira remained frozen in the hallway for a long moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. Beatrice had heard something the previous night, perhaps not enough to know exactly what had happened, but certainly enough to deepen her suspicions further, and Alira had no doubt whatsoever that her stepsister would carry this small detail directly to Lord Grant at the very next opportunity. The 3 days leading up to the council meeting passed in a haze of tension and careful vigilance. Alira barely left her bedchamber except for meals, terrified of leaving any further opportunity for Beatrice or the bribed maid to search her belongings, though there was nothing left to find now that the papers had been safely delivered into Julian's hands. Still, the fear lingered, a constant, gnawing presence that made even the simplest daily routines feel fraught with danger. On the evening before the council meeting, Charlotte arrived at the manor unannounced, her expression grave as she pulled Alira aside in the garden, well away from any listening ears. "I have heard something troubling," Charlotte said without preamble. "My brother overheard Lord Ashworth speaking with 2 of his own household guards this afternoon, discussing plans for tomorrow's council meeting. Alira, I do not know exactly what they intend, but the words disruption and public humiliation were both mentioned, along with your name." Alira's stomach twisted painfully. "What are they planning?" I could not learn the specifics, Charlotte admitted. But whatever it is, they intend to act tomorrow during the council meeting itself, when the greatest number of witnesses will be present to see it happen. Alira thought immediately of the stepsister's earlier scheme at the grand feast, the mockery and humiliation that had followed her from the very first moment of the evening, and a fresh wave of dread washed over her at the thought of whatever new humiliation Lord Grant might be planning to unleash before the entire assembled council. At the exact moment the truth was meant to finally set her free. She sent word to Julian immediately, relaying Charlotte's warning through Margaret's trusted contact within the castle gates, though the response that came back offered little comfort beyond a brief assurance that he had been warned, and that he would take whatever precautions he could manage before the meeting began. That night Alira barely slept at all, staring up at the dark ceiling of her bedchamber as she turned every possible scenario over in her mind, searching desperately for some way to prepare herself for whatever cruelty Lord Grant Ashworth had planned. But no amount of preparation, she realized as the first gray light of dawn finally broke over the horizon, could truly ready her for what was about to unfold within the grand council chamber of Ambervale Castle. The great council chamber of Ambervale Castle had never looked so full. Rows of carved wooden benches lined either side of the long stone hall, filled with nobles from across the region, all of them summoned by formal notice that the Duke intended to address a matter of significant importance to the future of his household. Alira sat near the back beside her stepmother and stepsisters, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. Baron Ellsworth, Lady Prescott, and Lord Fairweather sat prominently near the front of the chamber, close enough to the raised dais where Julian would soon stand that their presence alone signaled a clear alliance to anyone paying close attention. Lord Grant Ashworth sat several rows back, his posture relaxed, his expression pleasant, though Alira could see the sharp, watchful tension in the set of his shoulders that betrayed his outward calm as nothing more than careful performance. Beatrice leaned close to whisper in Alira's ear, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You look rather pale, sister. Whatever could be troubling you on such an important occasion?" Alira said nothing, keeping her eyes fixed forward as trumpets sounded, and the great chamber doors opened to admit Duke Julian Ambervale, dressed in formal dark robes trimmed with silver, his expression composed and dignified as he made his way to the raised dais at the front of the hall. The chamber fell silent as Julian took his place, Whitfield standing quietly at his side with a small wooden box held carefully in both hands. "Thank you all for answering my summons," Julian began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast stone chamber. "I have called this council today to address a matter of great personal and political importance, one that concerns the future of Ambervale and my own household." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Alira felt her heart pounding so loudly she was certain those seated nearest her could hear it. "Nearly 2 years ago," Julian continued, "my late father entered into a private agreement with Lord Edwin Voss, a respected and honorable member of this very court. That agreement named a betrothal between myself and Lord Voss's daughter, Lady Alira Voss, a promise sealed by both fathers before their untimely passing." The murmur swelled into a wave of surprised whispers, heads turning throughout the chamber to find Alira seated near the back, her face burning under the sudden weight of 100 curious stares. Beatrice's mouth had fallen open in genuine shock, and even Nora, usually so quick with a clever remark, sat frozen in stunned silence. "I understand this news comes as a surprise to many of you," Julian continued, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the growing murmur. "I chose to keep this arrangement private until I had secured proper counsel and support, understanding that such an announcement carries significant weight for the future of this region. Today, I present proof of that agreement before this council." Whitfield stepped forward, opening the small wooden box to reveal the bundle of papers Alira had guarded so carefully within her hidden floorboard, now smoothed and organized for formal presentation. He carried them to the front of the dais, where several council elders leaned forward to examine the documents, their seals, and the signatures of both Julian's father and Alira's own father unmistakable evidence of the arrangement Julian had described. It was at that exact moment, as the elders murmured their confirmation of the document's authenticity, that Lord Grant Ashworth rose smoothly from his seat, his voice cutting cleanly through the chamber's rising noise. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace," he said, his tone smooth and reasonable, though Alira could hear the dangerous edge lurking beneath his carefully measured words. "But before this council accepts such documents as genuine proof, might I suggest a rather important question? How can we be certain these papers were not forged, perhaps quite recently, by someone with a great deal to gain from such a convenient arrangement?" A fresh murmur rippled through the crowd, and Alira felt her stomach twist painfully as several council members exchanged uncertain glances. "The seals bear my father's own crest, verified by 3 separate elders of this council already," Julian said evenly, though Alira could see the tension building in his jaw. "I fail to see grounds for such an accusation, Lord Ashworth." "Perhaps not forgery, then," Lord Grant continued smoothly. "But I wonder, Your Grace, whether this sudden announcement might have another, more troubling explanation. I have it on reliable authority that a member of Lady Voss's own household staff was bribed rather generously in recent weeks, in exchange for certain private papers. One wonders whether that bribery might have flowed in quite the opposite direction from what this council has been led to believe." The accusation landed like a physical blow across the chamber, and Alira felt every eye turn toward her once more, this time carrying a very different kind of scrutiny entirely. Beatrice's face had gone pale beside her, and for one terrible moment, Alira feared her stepsister might actually confirm Lord Grant's insinuation, whether out of genuine belief or simple opportunism. But before anyone else could speak, Julian's voice rang out across the chamber, sharp and commanding in a way Alira had never heard from him before. "An interesting accusation, Lord Ashworth, particularly given that the bribery you describe originated not from my household, nor from Lady Voss's, but from your own." The chamber fell utterly silent. "Whitfield," Julian said, and the steward stepped forward once more, this time producing a second, smaller document from within his coat, along with a small leather pouch that jingled faintly with coin as he held it aloft. "2 nights past, my household guards apprehended a young stable hand employed at the Voss Manor, caught attempting to sell private family documents to an unnamed buyer near the eastern edge of town. Upon questioning, the young man confessed readily to receiving payment from Lord Ashworth himself, in exchange for searching Lady Voss's private study, and later, her personal bedchamber." Lord Grant's carefully composed expression cracked for just a moment, a flicker of genuine alarm crossing his sharp features before he managed to smooth it back into practiced calm. "This is an outrageous fabrication," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I have no knowledge of any such arrangement." "The stable hand's confession has been formally recorded before 3 witnesses of this council," Julian said, his voice hard as stone, "along with a detailed description matching your own household guard, who accompanied him to the tavern meeting where the coin exchanged hands. I have the signed testimony here, should this council wish to examine it." Whitfield produced yet another document, and several council elders rose to examine it directly, their expressions growing increasingly grim as they read through the detailed account. Lord Grant remained standing, his face now pale with the dawning realization that his own scheme had been thoroughly exposed before the very council he had hoped to sway. "Lord Ashworth," Baron Ellsworth said, rising from his seat with obvious displeasure, "it appears you attempted to secure private family documents through bribery and deception, and then had the audacity to accuse His Grace of the very crime you yourself committed. This council does not look kindly upon such conduct, particularly from a man who claimed to have this region's best interests at heart." Lord Grant's mouth opened and closed several times, searching desperately for some response that might salvage the situation, but no words came. The confident, calculating man who had entered the chamber that morning had been reduced, in a matter of minutes, to something far smaller and far more desperate. "I move," Lady Prescott said calmly, rising to stand beside Baron Ellsworth. that this council formally recognized the betrothal between His Grace, Duke Julian Ambervale and Lady Alira Voss, as proven by the documents presented today, and that we further condemn the actions of Lord Ashworth as unbecoming of his position within this court. A chorus of agreement swept through the chamber, and Alira watched, still scarcely able to believe what she was witnessing, as council member after council member rose to voice their support. Their earlier suspicion transformed entirely into open admiration for the way Julian had handled the confrontation. Julian turned from the dais to look directly at Alira, and across the crowded chamber, their eyes met, and Alira saw in his expression something that made her chest ache with a strange, overwhelming warmth. He extended his hand toward her, a silent invitation before the entire assembled court, and slowly, with her heart pounding and her legs trembling beneath her simple gown, Alira rose from her seat and made her way to the front of the chamber. Beatrice and Nora watched with expressions of stunned disbelief as their once-mocked stepsister crossed the stone floor with quiet, steady grace, and took her place beside the Duke of Ambervale before the eyes of the entire assembled nobility. This council recognizes the betrothal, the eldest of the presiding elders announced formally, between Duke Julian Ambervale and Lady Alira Voss, sealed by the honor of their late fathers and confirmed before this court today. Applause rippled through the chamber, genuine and warm, and Alira, standing beside Julian at the front of a hall that had once laughed so cruelly at her expense, felt tears of relief and disbelief prick at the corners of her eyes. Lord Grant Ashworth slipped quietly from the chamber amid the celebration, his earlier confidence utterly shattered, while behind Alira she could hear Beatrice's whispered voice, no longer sharp with mockery, but strangely, unexpectedly uncertain. "I did not know," Beatrice murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "I truly did not know." Alira did not turn to acknowledge the words. For the first time since the goblet had slipped from her fingers at the grand feast, she found she no longer needed her stepsister's approval, or their apologies, or anything else from them at all. News of the council chamber's decision spread through the region faster than any messenger could have carried it, passed from household to household until, within a matter of days, there was hardly a noble family within a week's ride of Ambervale who had not heard some version of the story. The details grew and shifted with each retelling, as such stories always do, but the essential truth remained constant. The clumsy girl mocked at the grand feast had been the Duke's chosen bride all along, and the man who tried to destroy her had been exposed as a schemer before the entire assembled court. Alira found the sudden shift in how people regarded her almost dizzying. Where once she had walked through gatherings trailed by whispers and mocking laughter, she now found herself greeted with careful courtesy, even genuine warmth, from families who had barely acknowledged her existence a month earlier. It was, in some strange way, harder to accept than the mockery had ever been, though Julian assured her, with a wry smile, that she would grow accustomed to it in time. "People are fickle," he told her one afternoon, as they walked together through the castle gardens, no longer needing to hide their conversation from prying eyes. "They will follow whatever wind blows strongest. What matters is that you know your own worth, regardless of which way that wind happens to be blowing on any given day." "That is easy for you to say," Alira replied, though there was no real bitterness in her voice, only a kind of tired amusement. "You have never had an entire hall laugh at you for dropping a goblet." Julian chuckled softly. "No, I suppose I have not. Though I confess, watching you walk back into that hall afterward, head held high despite the laughter, was the moment I first understood why my father chose you for me, even before I had ever properly spoken with you myself." They had reached a small stone bench beneath an ancient oak tree, and Julian gestured for her to sit, settling beside her with the easy familiarity that had grown steadily between them over the weeks since the council meeting. "What happened to Lord Grant?" Alira asked, a question that had lingered in her mind since the chamber had erupted into applause weeks earlier. "He has been formally stripped of his council seat," Julian said. "His niece's marriage prospects have suffered considerably as a result of his conduct, and I understand he has retreated to his country estate, largely avoiding public gatherings since." I doubt we will hear much from him again, though I intend to remain watchful all the same. Men like Lord Grant rarely accept defeat gracefully, even when they have no remaining power to act upon their bitterness." Alira nodded slowly, grateful at least that the immediate danger seemed to have passed, even if lingering caution remained wise. "And Beatrice, Nora." Julian's expression grew more careful, sensing the complicated tangle of emotions that question stirred within her. "Your stepmother has written to me twice this week, requesting an audience. I suspect she hopes to smooth over whatever damage has been done to the family's reputation, now that you stand to become a duchess rather than the household's overlooked stepdaughter." "And Beatrice herself, has she written?" "She has not," Julian said gently. "Though I understand from Lady Prescott that she has been notably quieter since the council meeting. Whatever pride she once carried seems to have been considerably humbled by the revelation of Lord Grant's true intentions toward your family." Alira was quiet for a long moment, watching a pair of sparrows dart between the branches of the oak tree above them. She thought of the years of mockery, the cruel nicknames, the countless small humiliations she had endured within her own household long before the grand feast had ever taken place. Forgiveness, she realized, would not come easily if it came at all, but perhaps in time something quieter than forgiveness might be possible. Understanding, maybe, or simple, distant civility. "I do not know what I feel toward them anymore," she admitted finally. "Not quite anger, not quite anything else either." "You do not need to decide today," Julian said. "There is no rule that says you must forgive them, or that you must remain angry forever either. You are allowed simply to feel whatever you feel, for as long as you need to feel it." Alira turned to look at him, struck once again, as she had been so many times since that first quiet corridor conversation, by how genuinely he seemed to see her, not as a duchess-to-be, not as a political arrangement sealed by two dead fathers, but simply as herself, complicated feelings and all. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing me capable of walking through all of this on my own terms, rather than simply telling me how I ought to feel." Julian reached over and took her hand gently in his own, an easy, natural gesture that had grown more comfortable between them with each passing week. "I meant what I said in that corridor, the very first night we truly spoke. I did not find you clumsy that evening. I found you remarkably brave. That has not changed, not for one single moment since." A comfortable silence settled between them, warmed by the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the oak leaves above. And for the first time in longer than Alira could easily remember, she felt something that might genuinely be called peace. Their formal wedding was announced for the following spring, giving both families, and indeed the wider court, ample time to prepare for what promised to be one of the most celebrated ceremonies the region had seen in a generation. Alira found herself, in the weeks that followed, gradually settling into a role she had never once imagined for herself, learning the intricate workings of castle life alongside Lady Prescott's patient guidance, growing steadily more confident with each passing lesson. Charlotte remained her closest friend throughout it all, a steady, grounding presence amid the swirling changes of Alira's new position, and the two of them spent many quiet afternoons together in the castle gardens, laughing over memories of simpler days, back before goblets and secret betrothals had ever entered either of their lives. As for Beatrice and Nora, their relationship with Alira never fully returned to warmth, though something resembling careful respect eventually took root where mockery had once flourished. Beatrice, in particular, seemed genuinely humbled by how close her own ambition had come to entangling her in Lord Grant's disgraced scheme, and though she rarely spoke of it directly, Alira sensed a quiet gratitude in her stepsister's manner whenever their paths crossed, gratitude that Alira had never exposed Beatrice's own role in Lord Grant's information gathering before the full council. On the evening before her wedding, Alira stood once more at the tall window of the very corridor where Julian had first revealed the truth to her so many months earlier, gazing out over the same dark castle gardens that had witnessed the beginning of everything that followed. Margaret found her there, smiling warmly at the sight of the young woman she had known since childhood, now standing on the threshold of an entirely new life. "You have come a long way, my lady," Margaret said softly, joining her at the window. "From a girl dropping goblets in a crowded hall to a woman about to become Duchess of all Ambervale." Alira smiled, reaching out to squeeze the older woman's weathered hand. "I could not have come this far without you, Margaret. Your loyalty, that night with the papers, all of it. I will never forget what you risked for me." "It was never a risk, my lady," Margaret said simply. "Only the truth, protected until it was ready to be told." Alira thought of those words long after Margaret had gone, standing alone once more at the window as the last light of evening faded into soft, gathering darkness. The truth, protected until it was ready to be told. It seemed, in many ways, to capture the entire journey she had walked since that first cruel laughter had echoed through the grand hall. A journey from mockery to recognition, from hidden secrets to open truth. From a girl no one truly saw to a woman the entire court had finally learned to respect. Tomorrow she would walk down that same grand hall once more, no longer as the clumsy girl mocked through the feast, but as the bride the Duke of Ambervale had known and chosen from the very beginning, long before the rest of the world had ever thought to look at her twice. A year had passed since the wedding bells rang across Ambervale, and the castle that had once echoed with cruel laughter now hummed with a very different kind of energy. The steady, purposeful rhythm of a household guided by a duchess who understood, better than most, what it meant to be underestimated. Alira rose early one autumn morning to find an unusual visitor waiting in the castle's receiving hall, a young woman dressed in traveling clothes still dusted from the road, her face pale with exhaustion and worry. It was Vivienne, Lord Grant's niece, the very woman he had once hoped to see married into the Ambervale line. "Your Grace," Vivienne said, curtsying nervously as Alira entered. "Forgive my unannounced arrival. I did not know where else to turn." Alira studied the young woman carefully, remembering the schemes that had once been built around her, though she saw nothing but genuine distress in Vivienne's tired eyes. "What has happened?" "My uncle," Vivienne said, her voice trembling slightly. "Since his disgrace before the council, his temper has grown unbearable, and his debts have mounted far beyond what our family estate can manage. He intends to arrange a hasty marriage for me to a merchant lord I have never met, purely to settle what he owes. I have nowhere else to go, Your Grace, and no one else who might believe a word I say against him." Alira felt an unexpected surge of sympathy, recognizing in Vivienne's frightened plea an echo of her own past helplessness, trapped by decisions made by others without any regard for what she herself wanted. She thought of Julian's own words from so long ago, in that quiet torch-lit corridor, and found herself extending the very kindness she herself had once been so grateful to receive. "You may stay here at Ambervale," Alira said gently, "for as long as you need. No one will force you into a marriage you do not want, not while you remain under this roof." Vivienne's eyes filled with tears of relief, and she pressed Alira's hand gratefully between her own. "Thank you, Your Grace. I did not expect such kindness, not after everything my own family attempted against you." "You were never responsible for your uncle's choices," Alira said simply. "I learned not so very long ago that a family's schemes do not have to become our own." Word of Alira's kindness toward Vivienne spread quietly through the region in the months that followed, further cementing her reputation not merely as a duchess chosen by fortunate arrangement, but as a woman of genuine compassion and quiet strength. Lord Grant, upon hearing of his niece's refuge at Ambervale, made one final, furious attempt to reclaim her through formal complaint before the very council that had once stripped him of his seat, only to find his petition dismissed swiftly, and without sympathy, the memory of his own disgrace still fresh in the minds of every elder present. Vivienne remained at Ambervale through the following spring, gradually finding her own footing within the household, eventually forming an unlikely but genuine friendship with both Alira and Charlotte. The three of them often found together in the gardens, laughing over matters far lighter than the schemes and betrayals that had once shadowed their paths together. As for Beatrice, A letter arrived at the castle one crisp morning bearing her familiar handwriting, though its tone carried none of the sharp mockery Alira remembered so well from years past. In careful, measured words, Beatrice wrote of her own recent betrothal to a modest but honorable young lord from a neighboring estate, a match built on genuine affection rather than ambition or scheming, and she closed the letter with a hesitant, unfamiliar phrase that Alira read several times before fully believing it. "I am sorry for the years of unkindness, sister. You deserved better from me, and I hope, in time, you might allow me the chance to prove I have learned that lesson properly." Alira folded the letter carefully and set it aside, uncertain, still, whether full reconciliation would ever be possible between them, but grateful all the same, for the small, genuine step Beatrice had finally taken toward it. Julian found her later that afternoon in the castle library, the letter still resting on the table beside her, and settled into the chair across from her with the easy familiarity of a year's comfortable marriage. "Good news, I hope?" he asked, nodding toward the letter. "I am not entirely certain yet," Alira admitted, "but perhaps in time it might become so." Julian smiled, reaching across the table to take her hand in his, the same warm, steady gesture that had grown so familiar over the past year. "That seems a fitting way to describe most things worth having, does it not? Not certain all at once, but built slowly in time, through patience and honest effort." Alira thought of everything that had led them to this quiet library, this steady hand holding hers, this life so entirely different from the frightened, mocked girl who had once dropped a goblet in a crowded hall. The laughter that had once wounded her so deeply had long since faded into memory, replaced by something far sturdier, a life built not on the opinions of a crowded room, but on trust, patience, and the quiet, unwavering knowledge of her own worth. Outside the tall library windows, the Ambervale gardens stretched golden and glowing beneath the autumn sun. The same gardens that had witnessed whispered secrets, desperate schemes, and finally, hard-won truth. And Alira found herself, in that peaceful, sunlit moment, profoundly and completely at home.